What's going on, everyone, and welcome into this edition of Philosophical Differences with Josh Jacobs of Dealing the Cards Pod and Brenden Schaeffer of b-schaeff Daily and all the other random stuff I do. Josh, how are we doing today? I like the lid. If you notice, if the eagle-eyed viewers notice, you're wearing that old school Cardinals lid. I've got it behind me on the bed, just as my background is always kind of pathetic, but that's one of the things that I put on there. You bought the hat, right? This was the Sonny Gray hat. We were talking about this before we came on, and how one night in the clubhouse after a sunny start, he was wearing this hat, and I even tweeted it out. I said, people, when you see this hat, when the video, Bally video or whatever comes out, you're going to love this hat. And sure enough, I think it sold out like that night.
Yeah.
But you got one in time, and I guess so did I. I've talked about it where I said I'm not going to wear Cardinals hats as a reporter, whatever, just be objective sort of thing. But I have to buy this hat because it's so cool. You're a Cardinals fan, man. You do your thing, and it looks great. I love the hat.
Yeah, like you said, when you tweeted it out, I was like, I'm interested to see. And then the second I saw it, I remember I think I replied in your chain, be like, does anyone know where to get this? I cannot find it anywhere. And then the next morning it was gone. So I'm glad I got it in. I just think it's like it kind of fits like the new age, like coloring and stuff, but it's old school at the same time. It's perfect. It's an S tier hat.
It was great, and for sure, I did. I grabbed it that night. I said, all right, I'm just gonna want to have it around. I collect hats. It's kind of off screen now, but I have just way too many hats on my hat rack in the office down here. So I'm like, we're just gonna do the hat thing, and now we have it, and now you've got it on, and so two hats in the same photo. I'm really sorry, folks. I don't think they're selling them anymore, but you can at least look at Josh's and marvel. All right, so last time we talked, we basically were wondering, can the Cardinals take advantage of a National League that's kind of down relative to our expectations? Teams like the Dodgers going through injuries on the pitching front. The Braves certainly dealing with a lot of injuries. Now, not just their pitching, but Ozzie Albies has since gone out. There's an opening here. Christian Yelich now with the Brewers is out for who knows how long. However, it's not necessarily wide open and ripe for the taking when it comes to the wild card, because teams like the Pirates and the D-backs are now kind of showing themselves to be still in the mix. Do we still feel the same way about this NL picture that the Cardinals can? Because I feel like before we're talking about, hey, maybe the number 2 seed overall skip the wild card series. Yeah. Now the Cardinals haven't scuffled, but they're not playing quite as well as they were, and teams from below them are starting to rise up. How do we feel right now about the state of the NL and how the Cardinals fit into it?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I still feel the same, but maybe what we didn't expand enough on last time is that the Cardinals aren't the only team who can make that argument. Like the Pirates, you do have Paul Skeens, you have Mitch Keller, you have Jared Jones. Like you've got the pitching, you add a bat or two. Like they can talk themselves into being an interesting postseason team. The Brewers, again, they just lost Yelich, and we'll see how long that's for if it is the full season. They've been good to start the year, but I think you and I have talked about that they kind of seem like a team that's due for some regression, but they could talk themselves into it too. I just think that there's a lot of teams in the National League right now that can talk. There's just so much parity. That's the word everyone's using right now. So I don't think I feel different about the Cardinals' chances of it. Maybe I'd say they're a little bit more of a house of cards than we gave them credit for last time. We talked about the bullpen being a really strong unit, but at the same time, it's like it just takes a couple of overusage days for that to wear thin. And that's really any bullpen in baseball. But when you don't have enough other strengths to lean on, then when that strength becomes a little bit more wishy-washy day to day, then until this lineup really heats up or until the rotation kind of bounces back, which we can talk about too, it's been struggling as of late. That bullpen, it relies all parts of the team rely on the other parts of the team. The bullpen can't be outstanding the whole year if the rotation is not giving enough innings and not being productive, and if the lineup is just not producing, right? And there's games where we look at the bullpen and they give up 1 or 2 runs and we blame the bullpen, but it's like, okay, but the Cardinals scored 2 runs that game. Like at some point you got to put up runs too. So I still feel like this team is capable of making noise in October with the appropriate upgrades. But I mean, the Dodgers could go out and make 2 crazy moves too, and then they're clearly the best team again. And the Braves could go make some interesting moves. The Pirates can make interesting moves. There's just the Diamondbacks. There's a lot of interesting teams out there. So I think the main lesson I've taken away from this last week is I still feel the same about the Cardinals. But if I were covering the Diamondbacks or looking at the Pirates more often, I'd probably be making the same argument for them.
And so right now we're like 4 or 5 days away from the trade deadline. We kind of seem to know what the Cardinals could use. Right? Could they use a nice starter to add to a potential wild card rotation? Sure. I think it's tough to know exactly who might get knocked out of the rotation if you added a guy right now, because your de facto number 5, Andre Pallante, has honestly been your best starter ERA-wise since he joined the rotation in late May. So does that become complicated? I feel like bullpen is an obvious area to upgrade. But then if you're Mozeliak and you're seeing, okay, like that was a pretty aggressive move by the D-backs, adding AJ Puk and giving away some prospects that are rated pretty nicely in their organization. I believe De Los Santos, the corner infielder that Miami picked up in the deal, immediately on pipeline was vaulted to like their number 4, number 5 prospect. So like that's a nice piece for them to get for a guy that when he started out in April as a starting pitcher, like AJ Puk doesn't look like he's going to have any sort of value. Now he's been lights out. So I think it's kind of savvy by the D-backs to basically say, hey, if you were thinking about maybe trying to come get us, get our Jordan Montgomery or our Randall Grichuk, think again, we're buying. And like teams in the AL like the Rangers are sort of in that mode now as well. We see the Rays maybe go a little bit of a different direction, trading away Arozarena. We'll get a little bit into that more in a moment when we kind of talk outfield, because I think that's another area where the Cardinals could decide to add. But as it pertains to bullpen, I see that as maybe the biggest area of need. Do you agree? And how does a trade like the AJ Puk deal or some of the rumblings that we're seeing with relief pitcher in that market, how is that going to maybe shape, in your opinion, what the Cardinals can do or maybe have a little bit of trouble doing? And what do you see as the biggest need as far as the bullpen goes? You want a righty? You want a lefty? Do you think they need both? Where do you kind of stand on all of that?
Yeah, it does feel increasingly like the bullpen is at least the most realistic place they can make the most significant upgrade. Like you could obviously argue a number 2 starter, a number 1 starter, and like if you got Jack Flaherty right now, Sonny Gray be your number 2. Jack Flaherty's that good, and I'm just saying he'd be the perfect fit. Think about this.
Let's pause on this for a second and go right into that.
Yeah,
And keep your train of thought. But I just wanted to say, and maybe we're about to say the same thing.
yeah,
It just felt like last year for sure Jack Flaherty would end up somewhere else, and he did. That Tyler O'Neill just wasn't going to stay on this team. There's no way. If you were to make in a lab the type, like the archetype of players the Cardinals could use right now, it's those two players. How frustrating is that? Like, give me the Cardinals fan perspective. You're always very reasonable, Josh. You always kind of can see both sides of things. I want the unhinged Cardinals fan perspective on how frustrating that is, because it's true. If you look at the numbers for those guys this year.
It's beyond. I have a story going up tomorrow that's talking about how the two. Basically, my headline was the most perfect answers to their greatest needs they let go of last year, and I would say it's beyond frustrating at this point. But I don't blame them necessarily, because I was in the same boat where I'm like, okay, yeah, you go and get assets for Jack Flaherty. The Tyler O'Neill experience it's just not going to work here. So I'm not mad. I'm not going to play the revisionist history of why did they get rid of either of them. But you look at Jack Flaherty right now, he's clearly the best rental arm available. He's a Cy Young candidate. Tyler O'Neill has his WRC plus is 2 points lower than his top 10 MVP finish in 2021. And his numbers against left-handed pitching right now, a 210 WRC plus, a 771 slug. Like he is the perfect player for this lineup right now. He could play a little center field if you need him to, play the corner outfields. Jack Flaherty Jack Flaherty is one of the best in baseball at preventing walks and striking out hitters right now. He's the perfect ace. Yeah, it's just like, of course, this is what's happening. We should for sure have conversations about why does this keep happening. And I think last year people could make the fair argument of like, okay, sometimes we overstretch the Adolis Garcia side of things. I don't know, the Randy Arozarena, that was a fail, but this one is just like, okay, again, like you can't do this every single year now where the guy you let go of. I mean, Mosaic joked about it, I think at the GM meetings, winter meetings, he's probably going to get some MVP votes. And guess what? He's going to get some MVP votes. So it's beyond frustrating. But back to your like deadline conversation, like unless it's a Jack Flaherty type, the Rangers don't look like they're going to sell now, but if it was a Scherzer, Eovaldi, I don't know what starter out there actually upgrades this rotation in a way that doesn't move Andre Palante out, like you said. And you look at the last 30 days, which is kind of skewed because the All-Star breaks some off days. So it's like 4 or 5 starts, but Palante's a 2.19 ERA in his last 4 starts. Everyone else in the Cardinals rotation has a 5.23 ERA or higher in the last 4 or 5 starts. So like, you're not going to move Gray out. You're not going to move Lynn out. You're not going to move Sonny Gray. You're not going to move, you're not going to move anyone except for Palante out, but he's your best starter right now. So I get the point of maybe getting some depth, but you guess you've got Steven Matz coming back. So it's a long-winded way to say you could get rid of that Geo spot, right? You could move Roy Croft off and get Pete Fairbanks, right? You could go high like that, or you could go get a random rental arm there. I think part of the AJ Puk side of things, right, is he has 2 years of control left, and you know that he could go back into the rotation at some point too. So you got to bake that in of like, hey, we're acquiring a guy that could be an interesting starter for us or a dominant reliever. So you pay up a little bit. But even then, it's like I think Baseball America had him, De Los Santos is like their 8th ranked prospect in the Diamondbacks or the Diamondback system at the time. So like he was a good prospect, but not like necessarily a stellar one at that. So I think that makes a lot of sense for a guy with control there that's been so dominant in the past few months out of the bullpen. And that's the kind of deal I would love the Cardinals to make, to give
Yeah,
up. I don't know what the equivalent of that is. Is that
that's
Gordon
the game.
Steffo? Is that
So
like
hard.
you can't just take? I mean, you know, this, you can't just take the 8th ranked prospect in the Cardinals system and say it's the same. There's a reason why when you move organizations, they all get reshuffled, right? Like the Mariners system is a lot deeper than other farm systems. And so you look at some of the prospects they gave up, like their 11th ranked prospect, and it's like, well, that guy's a little bit more interesting than probably the Cardinals' 11th
Or
ranked
what are his
prospect.
tools? Like what
Yeah.
what is it about him that a team would say, or the Rays in this instance about the guys they got from Seattle would say, hey, I like this guy because we think he can do A, B, C, or D.
Yeah.
Whereas in the same case of De Los Santos, a corner infielder who has obviously a really good hit tool and has power, has 920 OPS or whatever right now at AAA. Like there are attractive qualities to that. What's the equivalent from the Cardinals? Well, positionally, like there probably isn't one, right?
Yeah.
And so like it's sometimes more about, I mean, more than sometimes, and it's always about the player and that player's tools more so than do we have a comp. Sometimes comps are a little bit easier to come by, but to play that game and just say, oh, Cardinals shoulda, I understand
Mhm.
the sentiment behind it. It just understand that it's difficult to, we're not going to really know. Sometimes the Cardinals could maybe be involved in these same conversations for players, but if it doesn't happen to get reported, we're just going to say, oh, the Cardinals didn't even try it. We really, a lot of times, I would argue we never find out. The interesting part about deadline rumors and reports is just because a reporter may get a hold of a piece of information and share it with the world, it doesn't mean it's not true. Well, oh, that deal didn't come to fruition, so that guy must have been lying. No, that's not the case. But you also have to remember the context of just because something doesn't get reported doesn't mean it didn't happen. And that's
Yeah.
what's really difficult. I always try to throw that grain of salt. Like in this business, we want to be able to speculate and talk about things that we think are fun or interesting. But I think it's always good to have that as sort of the background to say, all of this being said, we may not really know for sure the ins and outs of how conversations may have gone. You would think maybe the Cardinals would be into an AJ Puk because there's a lot to like about a controllable arm who's wiping guys out right now, and also could be, somebody that, like you said, could figure it out and slot back in as a future starter, as though the Cardinals need more of those guys that you don't know whether they're starters or relievers. But I digress. But now, like, okay, from a bullpen perspective, you mentioned Pete Fairbanks, and I think it's interesting that we see the Rays trade Arozarena away kind of as he starts to find himself again. He wasn't really
Yeah.
off to a very good start this year. Numbers are coming up. They're right around 500. It's a deep AL wildcard chase. But I can't tell you for sure that the Rays are like, nope, we're out of it now. We're going to sell just because of this one move. They were trying to get rid of Randy in the offseason, and he is a guy that in ARB is going to make a pretty penny over the next
Oh
couple of
yeah.
years. They don't like to spend money. So I am focused on bullpen. Fairbanks, though, is cost controlled. He's under $4 million for next year, even if he hits his incentives. And then I think it's a team option for the following year for $7 million. As much as I think a Mizzou guy, a St. Louis guy would be awesome to get on the Cardinals, I think it would be really cool. And I think he's exactly what they need. The Rays don't necessarily, because they trade Randy, have to trade Pete Fairbanks. They can go, no, like we're not going to try to be terrible forever, and he's going to really be a valuable piece for us next year. I would be almost surprised to see Fairbanks moved. But let me ask about Zach Eflin, because I know we just got done saying, well, starter is going to be a more difficult thing to figure
Yeah.
out. But what do you think about Zach Eflin? If you just look at the ERA and you look at the money he's owed next year, you might go, don't they have that already? I think I've uttered that phrase myself. But I've also mentioned, if you look at some peripherals like FIP and some other expected, totals, you might go, Zach Eflin behind a Cardinal defense, or in front of a Cardinal defense, rather, with Mason Wynn at shortstop and Arenado at third and Ciani in center, and the list goes on. Pretty good defense. Generally, they've made mistakes this year, but I think we like where the Cardinals are defensively. Does Eflin become really interesting, especially under the notion that the Rays might be willing to give him up in a similar type of deal that just happened with Randy, where you go, this guy's going to make money next year, and we think we can reallocate those resources. I know bullpen would be a nice need, but Eflin is interesting. It's complicated after you get him in because, like you said, who goes out of the rotation for now? But just in terms of a longer range thought process, he's interesting, man. And you could see a world in which he gets here in St. Louis and for 2 months pitches well and maybe is a game 2 starter. Do you like him? Do you have concerns about him? What I think we always have to almost cater our thoughts toward what could the Cardinals do to not have to give up some premium pieces and improve, because we know they hoard their prospects. We know they're careful about giving up on a guy too soon, almost to a fault, to where then they end up giving up on a guy too late, and then he rebounds and he's Tyler O'Neill. But what are your thoughts on Eflin, generally speaking? Long way of asking the question, but where are you at on him?
I like Zach Eflin. I would kind of compare it, like if they acquired him, it'd be kind of what it felt like when they acquired Jordan Montgomery before we knew what he would become,
Mm,
right? Because like, I mean, I think we sometimes think every elite starter has elite swing and miss, but that's not true. Like Jordan Montgomery's never been an insanely good strikeout pitcher. He does increase have a pretty high chase rate, and that's something Zach Eflin does too. He induces a lot of weak contact. He gets you swinging at pitches you don't normally want to be swinging at. I think Zach Eflin can be like what we like Jordan Montgomery 2022 down the stretch, and best case scenario early 2023 Jordan Montgomery, a souped up, or actually not even the souped up, but like the good years Miles Michaelis with a little bit more strikeout in his game. And it's not fun necessarily to think about those kind of guys, but they are really productive. You don't have to have a 30% strikeout rate to be an elite starter in this game. I know Zach Eflin's not elite, but a low end 2, high end 3, I think that fits the bill. And again, sometimes I think we talk about like as like a fan perspective upgrades. And it's like if this upgrade doesn't make me a World Series contender, why even do it? I think Zach Eflin makes you a better team. And not just like a little bit. It's enough of an improvement that I think it's worth the complications that it puts in the rotation. The moves that I don't see a point of making is the Cal Quantrells, the Austin Gompers. It feels like a very lateral move. And best case scenario, it's a little bit better of what you already have. When Zach Eflin feels like a different tier of pitcher, he kind of feels like the tier of pitcher you don't have, where it's Sonny Gray, and then you there's a pretty big gap there. And then you go to Kyle Gibson, where it feels like Zach Eflin would slot above Kyle Gibson in my confidence meter. I know the numbers this year don't look as good, but to your point, getting behind a Cardinal defense, I think things could look a lot better. Do you love him pitching game 2 in a postseason series for you? No, you'd much rather game 3, but can he hold his own? Like the Cardinals got Jose Quintana and Miles Michaelis in that wild card series. They went toe to toe with Aaron Nola and Zach Wheeler, and it wasn't their fault they lost the series. I think it was 2-0 game 2. They had the lead going into the 9th inning game 1. So you don't all, and you even think about the Rangers rotation last year. Like I know Montgomery and Evaldi are awesome, but they're not aces. So if you just have guys that can give you that kind of start for 5 or 6 innings, and you've got the bullpen that they have or could upgrade along with it, then you see the recipe. You have to talk yourself into it, right? Like no one this time last year was saying, "Oh, look what the Diamondbacks are going to do if Brandon Pfaadt can just give them 4 really good innings." No one was
right.
talking about that. So again, that's the parity of the National League right now. Is you can have conversations like this, but then it can blow up in your face, right? Like Zach Eflin can have 3 bad innings in game 2 against the Braves, and none of this even matters. But I do like Zach Eflin. I do like that he's under key team control next year too. So yeah, there's some pros to it.
And you only get to play that game 2 of a wild card series once.
Yeah.
It's not like a simulation where you get to play it a bunch of times and play the percentages, but you have to sort of play the percentages when you're doing it. And you're like, does this pitcher have the makeup and the stuff to where you could squint and go, oh, this could be the 5 innings we need in a game 2? That's what's so hard, because you make these big sweeping decisions that are really about those moments in time. And does this guy have the moxie to be able to rise to the occasion for that moment in time, is something you can only really speculate on. It's there. That's where there is some kind of gut feel that goes into some of these conversations. Like, is this guy a dog or is he not? Is not very analytical in the way that but I tell you what, man, major league managers and coaching staffs, and I think even front offices have to sort of bake that in at parts. And the Diamondbacks last year are a great example, because you didn't go in saying, well, this rotation is lethal. We like to play the on paper game. We love the Phillies because you could go 1, 2, 3. There, who's stopping that rotation? We play the on paper game with teams like the Braves before all their starters get hurt, and go, who's stopping that rotation? But injuries and just weird stuff can happen, but it can happen in reverse, that a Brandon Pfaadt becomes him for a playoff run. And like it's never forgotten that guy did that, even if he ends up being just kind of marginal the rest of his career. I could see Eflin having some of the makeup to be able to, and for whatever people think of Ollie Marmol, to be able to, under a pitching plan that Ollie Marmol and his coaching staff and Dusty Blake put together, just like happened with Quintana, when they said, hey, we're going to get him through this part of the lineup, and then we're going to have, I forget who it was that came in to clean up an inning, but they had a plan. right? They knew where they wanted to go with it. And I maintain to this day that it worked exactly the way they wanted to, exactly the way it was described, a little vaguely, but described in the pregame office with Ollie Marmol chat that day. They wanted to get Jose Quintana through a couple times and then lean on their bullpen. This bullpen, it can be a strength, but with guys like JoJo not missing bats anymore, and we're not as confident in Kittredge, like, I do think that's an area that if they're going to lean on the rotation of 5 and dive when they get to the playoffs, having an elite bullpen and adding to it over the next week is probably going to need to be a part of that. But the other thing is, do you get to the playoffs without certain moves that happen in the first? Like, you have to consider what you need to do to get there.
Yeah.
And I don't think our mindset was that a couple of weeks ago. I think we almost were, and we know it's a long season. We can see it go both ways, but our mindset was almost, when the Cardinals get to October, and that there are some fans who are irritated by that because they're like, look, it's not over. And we all can see the standings, so we understand that. But it is interesting, like, how aggressive do they need to be just to get to the playoffs? Because then all these conversations about what you do when you get there could kind of fall flat if you don't actually get there.
Yeah. Well, I also think too, to speaking agree with that, but also to push back against, because there are people who look at like how the Pirates series went and just that they're not lately. They've been playing more like a 500 team. They haven't been that team that they've been winning or splitting a lot of series too. They're not falling apart even when the club around them, like, you look at the rotation and it's not performing like it should lately, but they're not going on some 6-game losing streak right now. Is that right around the corner though? It could be. We don't know. But that's the thing that gives me a little bit more confidence about this team being able to steady the ship and be a wild card team, is that I don't see the major lows coming again. But are they going to go on another 28-13 stretch? I don't know. They probably need to make upgrades to be able to do something like that again. I do think, to your point, though, the bullpen is where you're going to have to do it at this point, because you see the cracks, right? You see JoJo just not really performing at this point, and maybe that happens sooner than later. I don't. If I was hopeful that the rest would help him out. He does have a 1.5 ERA the last eight innings, but then I think he's got one strikeout.
That's the key.
So it's like,
yeah,
is that sustainable? Probably not. Helsley's been great. Fernandez has been great. Kittredge has been okay. Roycroft's been okay. But yeah, and especially because their rotation right now isn't giving them 6-7 innings either. They're having to play that basically postseason baseball every single game right now, where they're going 5 innings, 5 1/3 innings, really leaning in that bullpen.
and they're not always scoring.
Yeah, that's the other thing too.
Runs. That's what, and that's the thing you can't really fix at the deadline. Like, you can. We talk about Brent Rooker and we talk about making bold moves. And after a game, I think after game 3 against the Pirates, I went on the radio and I was like, just do something crazy. Can y'all just do something crazy? Add a bat and like trade away from your major league lineup if you have to. Like, just shake it up, because I can see the signs coming that even if you make October, you're talking about the potential for another 2022 wild card series to play out when it happens, because you're going to lose 2-1 and 3-1. You know what I mean? Like, what is it going to take for this offense to get there? But you can't really make those big changes without doing something bold and trading away a guy that you think is part of your present or your future. And I'm not talking about like, trade Paul Goldschmidt so that you can put Burley at first. Like, I don't think that's the kind of move. But I also don't know the guys that you could trade. Obviously, big names, but lesser production, like Gorman and Jordan Walker right now. That would be the bold thing that nobody would see coming. But is that even worth doing if the rest of the league, the other 29 teams, are telling you, nah, those are kind of marginal guys in terms of how we value them? You're not getting our premium rentals or our premium pieces for those names. If you're the Cardinals, you just have to grin and bear it. You just have to keep those guys and hope they hit, hope Arenado hits. If that's the strategy, you might be able to do all the bullpen stuff in the world, but is it going to make any difference if you get to October and this lineup doesn't have, which it's all about kind of being streaky, but doesn't have the good streak? It has the Pirates sort of weekend, and then you go, well, now what?
Yeah. And as of late too, Brendan Donovan's kind of cooled off. Newbar just hasn't been himself since he's come back from his injury, but that's actually kind of how he's been in his career. It's like this endless cycle of he gets hurt, he comes back, he's really slow, he heats up, then he gets hurt. And so if he could heat up and not get hurt, that would be really helpful for the offense.
Yeah.
So I think there is some and Mason Wynn also hasn't really been all that productive his last 100 at bats or so. So even if one of those guys were, I'm done like trying to, we all know if Paul Goldschmidt can get it going, but I'm not even going to be like, if Paul Goldschmidt gets it going, if Mason Wynn, Brendan Donovan, Lars Nootbaar get it going. Nolan Arenado's gotten it going. He's not hitting for the power that you want, but basically a 300 average guy since May.
Yeah.
So that's helpful. Alec Burleson and Wilson Contreras, you have zero complaints about. Gorman's actually been better lately as well. I think you could see the offense because it's top 10 against right-handed pitching. So like that's not really a weakness right now. Just whenever those darn lefties come in, that Martin
Martin
Perez,
Perez. Oh
like
my goodness.
it needs to be studied how they went from being so elite 2 years ago. And part of it, I get it, it's the left-handed bats coming in, and also obviously Paul Goldschmidt and Older Renato not being MVP candidates and not having Albert Pujols for the second half either. So I get that side of it, but it's just wild to be second best in all of baseball to go to be second worst in all of baseball in a matter of 2 years. And I also think if you can get maybe a little bit more out of your bench spots as well, like if you're finally moving on from Dylan Carlson and you get that maybe Tommy Pham type, like it's not going to transform the lineup, but can it be more productive in some of those RBI situations? I think maybe the overall stats won't look better, but maybe you can steal some wins here and there where usually like Goldschmidt's in that spot striking out, but instead you've got a single from Kevin Pillar. And it's like, okay, like, is he putting up the best stats in the world? No, but like we're getting the production we need in the big spots that they're just not getting right now. It feels like the game keeps finding the guys who are struggling. So I do think there's an argument still to make those incremental upgrades. To your point though, like last week, I started talking myself into like, okay, what if you do the Brett Rooker, Mason Miller thing? What if you go all out on it and you just go, we have the best bullpen in all of baseball. We've got Brett Rooker in our lineup now. But I mean, obviously Mason Miller's got a broken hand now, and that was never going to happen. Yeah. A's luck right there. So do you think they're going to add another bat to the lineup?
Let's do it this way. Incremental upgrades. We could have called the podcast incremental upgrades. If we're like playing off of the Moisms over the years, we went with philosophical differences just to be cheeky, tongue in cheek. We don't mean anything by it, but it's just fun. But incremental upgrades is actually a phrase that has been used by Mo that people kind of poo-poo. I actually think it makes a lot of sense this year. But if I were going to advocate for the devil on this one, I would say you do have Riley O'Brien that's like throwing, and maybe he comes back soon. I think his stuff is great. I'm skeptical that he's going to come back and not going to have those issues of walks. And it's like, I want it to work for Riley O'Brien, but we just don't know. But if you're the Cardinals and you're like, okay, but if we do make a trade for a bullpen guy and Riley's ready, what happens? I think it would be Roycroft and Gio, so you can find the room for that and still maneuver it. But that's a question. Like maybe if you went, like I think Tanner Scott, I don't know if he's getting traded, but because the Marlins might just be ready to collect as many prospects as they can. We don't really know. But I think Tanner Scott would be really interesting. Do you then do the Palante with Liberatore and say, go back to Memphis and just stretch out? Because for as much as I didn't like the Libby spot start on Wednesday, it should be acknowledged that a lot of the AAA rotation has been injured. I think Zach Thompson's coming back now, and there were some restraints on them. But my point has always been the restraints have been built in from the year because of the way that you have built this roster and built this pitching depth. Injuries hurt you, but that's still kind of the core of my complaint as to how their 6th, 7th, and 8th starter spots were considered this year. But that's kind of another story for another day. But when it comes to relief, I look at Riley. When it comes to do they get a bat, if Tommy Edman is ready in a couple of weeks, is the simplest thing like they trade Dylan Carlson for Matt Swanson 2.0 and a guy that's not on the 40-man roster, because then Tommy comes right in and occupies that spot, and you don't really have room, quote unquote, to do it. Or do you plan for the inevitability of somebody else is going to get hurt? Something's going to happen. So you need to sort of do the uncomfortable thing for a couple of weeks in August, maybe, of somebody who's in AAA that shouldn't be, or isn't used to being there, right? And you just have to kind of maneuver that for the potential that more injuries happen. Injuries do not cease to exist after July 30 just because the trade deadline is passed. So I think that's the conversation with the bench and the outfield situation, and it's the conversation with the rotation of how do you sort of maneuver knowing that you may have a need at a date later where you won't be able to address it unless you plan ahead and do it now. That's why I could see the Cardinals having a quiet deadline. They could trade Gio for a non-40 man. They could trade Dylan for a non-40 man and maybe add a reliever. But the reliever costs are going to be tough too. I think they have to do something, and I think they will. But I also think it could end up coming at the majority of the moves they talk about. If those come at costs that they're like, well, let's just roll with Riley O'Brien and Tommy Edman and see what happens. People are probably going to be upset by that. But I also, there's an argument to be made that it may be the safest course of action. My thing there is I don't care about being safe anymore. Just like YOLO it and see what happens, because you're always prudent. You're always safe. Give the fan base an opportunity to invest into something. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, but at least you tried. That's my hodgepodge of thoughts and comments about this whole situation. Does it make any sense, or should I have asked you a question to have you be able to answer something? Let's go with that as my question officially.
No, that makes sense, and I didn't that works as a question. I think if they sold it on it, I would see the thought process, but when you say it's safe, I would argue it's not safe because of all the things you said about the injuries. It's you're one Miles Michaelis injury away, which is kind of weird to say, but you are. You're one Ryan Hernandez going down away from that bullpen being even shakier. And it's like,
Yeah.
okay, so here's our response. It's Riley O'Brien, who hasn't pitched since opening day. We literally don't know what he is other than he looks really good in bullpens. He has great stuff. Like, okay, let's see. It could work. It could be really helpful. Or this team falls apart in the second half and it's a 78 win team and kind of people's points are proven. I think when I've talked about being optimistic about this team in the second half and its potential in the postseason, I'm baking in that they're going to be adding to this team. If you go past July 30th and this is the roster they still have outside of like, I don't know, like one reliever, I think that, I mean, I can't, can you see them doing nothing, like not making a single move?
No, but
Okay.
But you know what can make people mad is if the moves are just the clearing 40-man space for the injured guys coming back.
Yeah.
Like, because like Gallegos has gotten outs recently, but if you look at how they're using him, the reason I am so openly talking about trading Gallegos or just cutting him is because they don't seem to believe that he can be the seventh inning man or the eighth inning man that he used to be. And if Ollie Marmol's not willing to use him in that role, and I'm not even saying he's wrong for it, because Gio could regress once he's not pitching in garbage time, could regress back to struggling again. And then you're like, oh, we should have done something here. But it's clear in the way that he's used that they don't have much regard for him getting back into a leverage consideration. And if that is the case, I think you do have to shake his hand and say, we love you, buddy. And maybe do him the favor of trading him somewhere else like they did with the DeYoung last year, or even a Genesis Cabrera before that, where Cabby wanted to be a leverage guy somewhere, and the Cardinals were like, you're not really that for us. Whether they were right or wrong about that, he wasn't performing in those roles. And so he ends up going somewhere and was in leverage spots late in the season. Like, he got what he wanted out of it for the time being. I don't know if Gio can do that for somebody else or not, but if the Cardinals are going to make their decision and plant their flag on where they are on a certain guy, those are the kinds of moves that can be made. And then if they don't address anything else beyond those, it's like, underwhelming deadline. Could be. It could happen.
I think if you don't add to this bullpen significantly or add another front end starter, then you are planting the flag on this offense has to be what we thought it was in the second half. You have to start winning games by enough runs that you don't have to turn to Gio, or not Gio. You're not going to turn to Gio, or you went to you win it when the games by enough runs that you can turn to Gio.
There it is.
You need to that you can stretch out Michaelis and be like, hey, I know you're probably going to give up another run in this inning, but we're okay because we're up 6. Like, you have to get to that kind of point where you're not pulling your starters at 90 pitch counts, going to the bullpen for 4 innings. That's not going to be sustainable. I think people have been a little overly critical of it in the first half, but it's become enough of a sustainable stretch of that, enough of a sample size that this is, and we've seen the people start to break now, or at least the shattering a little bit. I don't think that's sustainable. And that's my worry, is that they're like, hey, we like what we have, which is, it's just what they like to say. We have reinforcements coming. We think we're going to see what happens. If they plant their flag on that, then they're basically saying Paul Goldschmidt has to be better. Brendan Donovan has to get back to being how he was in June. Mason Wynn has to be top tier again. Like, all these guys have to produce, or else this is not going to work. I don't see another scenario where this lineup can be middling and then not make the significant upgrades. And they honestly, I don't know if they can make the postseason with that, because I think the Pirates might add. I think that the Diamondbacks already did add. These other teams around you, I don't think all of them are going to add. Some of them will probably stand pat. But if you're the team that stands pat while everyone else is getting better, then I think that also changes that conversation we had last time in the beginning of this. Is I've been baking in, they want to make some upgrades. Everyone, it feels like people around you are making upgrades, and I don't know if the Cardinals are going to do it at this point.
So let me ask this. This might be where we kind of end on this thought. We've spent a lot of time talking about what they might need to do to make the playoffs and how expensive it could be. And like, all of our conversations are catered around that. I do think there is a segment of the fan base, because I see it in the YouTube comments from time to time, where people basically say this team is not going anywhere, so don't bother adding these incremental upgrades where you might give up the next Adolis or the next, whatever, the next Lane Thomas, where you go, man, 2 years, I wish I still had him. Don't give away anything that could be part of your future for this group, because I don't believe in it. That's what some Cardinals fans would say. I have maintained, I think it's important that they do make the playoffs, because I sort of cling to, that's what John Mozeliak told everybody they were going to try to do in the offseason. They said last year was a one-off, and we're going to get better. We're going to do the things necessary to improve it. And they added some pieces in the offseason that got them to this point. But it was always, I think, of the build that you might have to do a little bit more in July. Here's July. Here's the chance to do more. You're right in the spot that a lot of people maybe thought you would be. Do they make the moves to push themselves over, or do they not? Is it not worth it? I don't think I'm saying the organization will think it's not worth it to back this team, but there's some fans who say, just making the playoffs, who cares? I want to get to the point again where Cardinal baseball, you can expect to not only get in as the prerequisite, but we're built then to go places once you get in. Does some Flex Seal tape and bubble gum and paper clips at the deadline make it so this organization is in a better spot moving forward to eventually get back to that standard? Or are you kind of looking at this going, just focus on 2025, because this is so crowded that statistically it may not be that likely that you make it, because there's 6 teams vying for 3 spots essentially right now. And so it's a coin flip whether you get in the first place. Is it worth it, in your opinion, as a Cardinals fan, for them to just get in and then see where the chips fall, knowing that it may be a short stay in October? Or do you kind of agree with some of the fans that go, if it's not NLCS bound, it's not for me? Where do you land on that?
I'm going to compare the 2021 and 2022 deadlines, because yes, they got John Lester and it worked. Yes, they got Jay Happ and it worked. But if they somehow managed to win that wild card game, you can't convince me that John Lester, Jay Happ, and Wade LeBlanc were going to win you an NLDS. But you could convince me that Jordan Montgomery and Jose Quintana and Miles Michaelis could scrap their way to winning an NLDS if they had made it past the Phillies in that series. And they were that felt like a coin flip series. They should have had they really should have had game 1. And if you had game 1, the odds of you winning that series are up.
You win game 3. You win game 3, because that was a version of the Cardinals that could kill lefties. And Ranger Suarez, as good as he's turned out to be, was not going to stop that lineup in game 3.
No.
Just saying.
So if you make an upgrade that you can see how it benefits them in October as well, I think it's worth it. If you're making an incremental upgrade just to make it to the postseason, but when you get there, it's not going to make a difference, I don't see the point in that one. So for me, that's comparing Zach Eflin to Austin Gomber or something like that. If you're going to go add Austin Gomber, that's not worth it to me. If you're going to add Zach Eflin, go for it. If you're thinking, hey, we need to add another arm, then and you can't get Zach Eflin, you can't get Jack Flaherty, you can't get like these guys that'll make a real difference, then go bolster the bullpen, because you can convince me when you get to in the regular season, it will help them. And you can convince me in October that, hey, we can get 4 innings out of Michaelis, and it's not going to look great when you have Andrew Kittredge coming in the 5th inning. You're like, okay, we've got to have this whole bullpen game, but you could win that game. But if you're putting Austin Gomber out there for a game, you're not convincing me they're serious about winning a series here. So I think incremental upgrade that you can see how it helps them in October as well. I don't know if I think some people would see it as an incremental upgrade, but I can see the significance of it. If the incremental upgrade is just to get you there, I don't think it's worth it for this team.
I like that. And I think they've got to be targeted in the way that they approach the names that they're like. There's got to be a plan for not only how he helps you for the next 2 months, but how does he help you in game 1? How does he help you in game 2 when you get to October? I think that's actually a really valid way to look at it. Let us know in the comments if you kind of see that same perspective or if you have a different one. I said I was going to end on that, but I want to know, do you think it's worthwhile? And maybe throw out a couple of names. It doesn't have to be rentals, but I want to know, do you think rental relievers, rental players are worthwhile? Because you could incremental upgrade your way with rentals, but those guys could still help you in October. But then you're also going, did we just sacrifice something from the future for a guy that we're not going to have signed beyond this year? Because I look at a Tanner Scott, I'm like, well, going to help you. He checks the box, going to help you for 2 months, going to help you if you get to October, but rental, doesn't have a long contract. But I still feel like that's probably worth it if you check the other boxes, even if you're giving up a Graceffo or like a future guy that could be a starter. If you thought he could be a starter, why didn't he start for you this year? Is sort of my mindset. Like, start to be able to churn out that 40-man if the guys that are on the tail end of it aren't guys that you really have a ton of faith in, but maybe another team could see them as a league minimum starter for the next 3 years. Grab a rental reliever with that. It's really no skin off my back.
Yeah, agree. I mean, that's what they did with Andrew Kittredge this past offseason. Again, it's not full rental, but it was 1 year for 6 years of Palacios. Like,
Yeah.
and I'm not crying about that. Like, I think Palacios could be a good player, but Kittredge has been a very valuable piece. If you go back to that 2021-2022 comparison, like giving up Lane Thomas for a body that can give you starts, that's frustrating to me. Even though I mean, in the moment, like the
Did you hate it
outcome's
then?
frustrating. No, I didn't hate it then,
Okay.
but I think at the risk of that's when it's like, okay, well, the upside of John Lester, there wasn't. It was just, hey, can you give us the starts? Which I know they needed that. But then so that's when I go back to, is that really worth the potential of getting up Lane Thomas? I question that one more. Jose Quintana, though, like if Johan Oviedo ends up being a number 3 starter, well, Jose Quintana was good in the regular season and he was good in that postseason game. And so the ball flips a different way. Ryan Helsley doesn't hurt his finger. They might go deeper. I get why you made that risk there. So I think for a Tanner Scott, like, yeah, he would be a dynamic reliever in the back of the bullpen where if it doesn't work out, I saw the thought process of how it works out in a wild card series, NLDS. Again, if it's John Brebbia, like I think the price point's a lot lower on that. And I can see how it's really helpful to you. So I like rentals. It just, again, it goes back to that conversation of, can you convince me they can make a difference in October too? If so, then it's worth the risk to me of Gordon Graceffo turning out into a mid-rotation arm. And it's like, well, that's frustrating, but you also have Quinn Matthews, you have Tink Kentz, you have Cooper Jerpy. It doesn't mean those guys aren't going to work out, but you're not, I mean, that's how you felt about Sandy Alcantara and Zach Gallen when you gave them up before too. So it's not a great argument, but at the same time, like at some point you either hold on to everyone, and that never seems to work out either, or you trade everyone and you know that sometimes it's not going to work out. So I don't know. If it goes back to that conversation, does it make a difference in October? If it does, yes. If not, I'm out.
All right. Because you mentioned Lane Thomas, and maybe the Cardinals add Lane Thomas to the deadline. Like, who knows? For real. But the thing that, and I tie this to a current situation that they have, and almost in a way that if I were like a salesman, I would try to sell this to 29 other teams, or however many other teams are sellers right now and not contending, but could use a flyer on somebody. Lane Thomas, circa 2021, was awful with the Cardinals, but he had COVID and he had long COVID, and that, I think that probably played into it all. And I really liked Lane Thomas before he kind of fell off, but you had seen the tools and then just absolutely bottomed out. Defensively looked lost. I think the illness was part of that. But if you're the Cardinals at that point, you're like, well, we can't keep throwing him out there. Every time we do, he, kicks the ball over the fence. And it's like, what is going on here? This is not the Lane Thomas we know. And eventually, if you can get a John Lester for that guy that you're basically at the end of your rope with, you go, all right, let's just go ahead and do that because it fills a need right now. And you can stomach it regardless of how it may go in the future. I think that's how Lane Thomas played out. I am looking at Dylan Carlson going, I've seen Dylan Carlson be a very good baseball player before. It's been a couple years maybe since we've seen him at his best, but I've seen it in real life. I remember it. It doesn't look like the version of Dylan that's out there right now. But if I am a team like the White Sox or like the Marlins, and I don't even want to bake the Skip Schumacher angle into it anymore because I don't know how involved he's really going to be in terms of those decisions. I think they're probably on their way to separating and mutually. Yeah. Right? I think it's going to be better for him to be with an organization that he's part of the vision, and I think he's going to be a long-time big league manager. But I don't even look at it like, oh, does Schumacher think highly of Dylan? If he doesn't, then it could never happen. Like, I don't know. But those types of teams that are clear sellers at this point, and they have rentals to give up, if I'm one of those teams, I would be going, well, look at what every outfielder does after they leave the Cardinals. And this guy, we've seen a 780 OPS season from Dylan Carlson. If I'm one of those teams, I am trading a rental to the Cardinals for Dylan Carlson and putting him in my outfield every single day the rest of the year, because I honestly think change of scenery, just like with O'Neill, just like with Lane Thomas, I think would actually help Dylan Carlson. So I keep people that say, oh, trade Carlson away. I'm like, okay, I think when you say that, you think he has the value to get something super valuable and you could throw in a Carlson as part of a package. I'm like, I don't really think he doesn't move the needle as part of a package. But if I've got a rental, and I'm like, I don't know, throw him out there and just see what does it cost me as a team? Virtually nothing. And if it works out, I've got a 750 OPS outfielder that can play all 3 spots for the next couple of years. I hope that for Dylan's sake, Dylan Carlson gets that this week, because I don't think the Cardinals have him in the plans for anything like it. But does the comp to Lane Thomas and sort of remembering back to how it looked for him at the time, could that be a selling point? If I'm the Cardinals, I'm calling teams going, have you seen Lane Thomas? Have you seen Adal? Have you seen all these guys? This is what we do. We are kingmakers when it comes to outfielders improving after they leave. Don't look at Dylan Carlson's stats this year. Look at what he's going to be for you. That would be my salesman pitch to other teams.
The vibes I'm getting from that argument is like when some dude reaches out to you in fantasy football and like sends you a trade calculator. It's like, see, you're winning the trade. Accept it. That's how I feel like the Cardinals come across with Dylan Carlson right now. Like,
they don't even have to sell it. They're like, we're not asking for the world from you.
Yeah,
it's a rental. It's John Brebbia, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Just this guy's controllable. And if he turns out that we got it wrong again, you throw the eggs on our face again. And how funny would that be? I would lean into that if I were John Mozeliak calling things about Dylan. Just like to have some humor about it, because at this point, it's the elephant in the room unless you talk about it, and then it's kind of out in the open. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think to me, again, maybe I'm splitting hairs here, and I'm not someone who freaks out on Twitter every time Blaine Thomas hits a home run and is like, he used to be a Cardinal. But the part where I am frustrated by is John Lester. You knew the upside was basically, hey, can you just give me innings?
Yeah.
John Brebbia, I can be convinced that he can give me a really important inning in the 6th or 7th inning of a playoff game where the game could have been won or lost, but John Brebbia shut it down. Is he the best name in the world? No, but like, I know Dylan Carlson isn't going to give me anything in that playoff game when John Brebbia will. That's the swap I would make. Versus if it was, keep throwing out Austin Gomber, but if it's Austin Gomber,
he's taking some shrapnel here. I mean,
yeah,
he's a good dude, Josh. I don't know what you're playing at. He's pitched well this year.
Another name like that. That's but I think away from home it's been really bad, which is weird because he pitches at Coors Field. I just don't believe. I don't want a Rockies pitcher. I'm out on that. So Cal Quantrill, I know he's got the aura right now, but I think I'm out on that too. So
we're just gonna leave that. We're just gonna leave that where it is, I think, for the sake of this one. Okay. I think this was good. I think we went 45 minutes, and that's about all that we need. Josh, anything you got to leave the people with? Plug your deal in the cards. Plug anything you guys are doing coming up.
Yeah, we've got obviously we got recording on Sunday as usual, and then we are doing a trade deadline live stream. So not exactly sure what time we'll go live yet, but we'll react to some of the moves that are happening, and hopefully the Cardinals have some movement that's significant, or at least that we can all be like, hey, that was interesting, right? It'll be a really sad stream if we're just waiting and clock strikes 0 and it's nothing. So, or Dylan Carlson for the Matt Svanson. That will be frustrating. But you can watch us cry about it live. So
you can, but Matt Svanson has 16 saves for Springfield. Not sure if you're aware of that. But
I didn't.
Because I'm just doing like a little minor league segment at the end of every podcast now. I call it Down on the Farm, and I move like Cal. Yesterday I was like, oh, he's got a 2.89 ERA for Springfield, but he's like 25. I think he'd have to elevate to AAA before you could really start to think about him being involved. But sometimes those deals are just the deals that you have to make, that you have to stomach. But it would be nice if they would also make some adding to the 40-man roster, adding to the active roster type of deals over the next couple of days. So stay tuned to that on the Deal in the Cards YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to this channel, to b-schaeff Daily, and all those feeds for the continuation of our podcast, Philosophical Differences. I was on vacation last week, but we should pretty much be good to go for the most part on Fridays moving forward with myself and Josh. So appreciate you guys all for tuning in. Josh, thank you for joining me once again.
Yeah.
That'll do it for this edition of the show. We'll talk to you next time on Philosophical Differences. Peace.